So we are all set up. And as you can see, my proposal for today is to continue with the intermittent series that we've been engaged in and we continued with last week, as I've done in weeks past. I also want to spend a minute or two speaking with you about what's in the news. And I feel like we're inundated with so many things that are norm shattering, potentially illegal, weighty, and disturbing, right? It's one of the reasons to do this lecture series is just to take a little bit of a break from, right, the weight of the constant cascade of bad news. But it's also the case that from that right onslaught, I think it's worthwhile highlighting at least the things that seem to be perhaps most significant or important in the last week's news cycle. And so I'm not going to talk about the fact that the Department of Homeland Security has had its funding lapse. I do think, we're potentially going to see a protracted standoff between Democrats and Republicans in Congress and between Democrats and this administration over the question of whether or not minimally, right, legal standards are going to be placed on DHS officials, ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, when they patrol neighborhoods. And I'll tell you what I think the Democrats should be holding out for. It's not just that the masks should come off, that body cameras should go on, that identifying regalia and name badges have to be in place before these officers are deployed to American cities, but also no more searches, right? That it should be illegal to do what was done in Minneapolis, and that the enforcement of immigration law, which I think we can agree, even though it is perhaps at base unjust, there is still the political will, and we live in a democracy, and so it has to proceed, but it has to proceed in a way that doesn't involve laying siege to American cities, does not allow the president essentially to use immigration enforcement as a pretext for bringing tremendous stress and hence leverage to bear on an American city. I don't think we're going to be all the way there, but if I were advising Democrats in Congress, that's what I would advise them to hold out for. And by the way, it would eventually, I believe, impact the parts of the Department of Homeland Security that the president actually cares about, the parts that constitute, as I've said to you, the infrastructure for a police state that is being built within this administration. But that's not what I'm going to pay attention to. What I'm going to pay attention to is the good news, which is that the surge in Minneapolis is ending, right? And it's not just a welcome relief to the people of Minneapolis. It is a major victory for democracy in its most important form. The people coming into the streets to resist lawless, ruthless, and potentially tyrannical uses of violence and state power, coercion instruments to punish, to cow, to intimidate them, and ultimately to force them to change policy and behavior that is supported in their state, right? And so I think, frankly, everyone in America owes gratitude to the people of Minneapolis for the courage, for the sacrifice, for the resolve, for the commitment to democratic freedom they've displayed. And as I've said to you, right, I think the right way to view this is that this was not an immigration enforcement operation. This was a trial. This was a beta test for employing paramilitary forces into blue cities in the United States in order to repress the people who live there, and that the most important case in which this could be done would be in and around a national election. And of course, we have national elections approaching in November of this year. And so I do hope that the people of Minneapolis have succeeded in at least making it more costly for this administration to contemplate and perhaps eventually deploy similar kinds of surges to Phoenix or Houston or Atlanta or Philadelphia in order to make it extremely difficult and costly for the people of those cities to vote, because those are the cities that potentially tilt the outcome of the election in those states in 2026 or decide key congressional contests in 2026. And I'll just ask you again to think through the scenario. You are a black or brown person in Houston or Phoenix, and it's voting day. You haven't voted by mail, and you're thinking about going to the polling place, and your city is swarmed by ICE and Custom and Border Patrol officials, and they are ramming vehicles, breaking windows, pulling people out of the vehicles on the basis of what the Supreme Court has allowed them to do, racial profiling, right? And this is exactly what's happened in Minneapolis, right? And so the idea that, well, I think it's important to vote in this election, but is it important enough to risk being arrested, thrown in a detention center, being cut off from my family, my job, my other responsibilities? And by the way, we have seen these agents will use deadly force. Is it worth being injured or killed to exercise my right to vote? And that is, I think, the deeper, most frightening aspect of the new technology and staffing, the kind of recruiting that has been done in this administration that allows it to exercise a power, a kind of coercion, a level of intimidation that frankly should not be possible in a democratic society. And the people of Minneapolis succeeded in pushing back against it and making it untenable for the Trump administration to continue this kind of repression. And as I say, right, it's not just that the Department of Homeland Security troops are withdrawing, retreating from Minneapolis. It's that the president's approval rating is at an all-time low for his second term. And by the way, excuse me, I have to sneeze. There we go. The president's approval rating is driven down, right, despite the fact that inflation seems to be improving, that unemployment is not too bad. It does seem that, in fact, the brutality, lawless violence, intimidation that's being done in Minneapolis, and as I said to you a couple weeks ago, right, the images that this occupation is generating and the way in which they distribute sympathy and respect, right? The idea, and this just came to my attention, that Kristi Noem, I'm sorry, Pam Bondi, not Noem, and it's worse that it's Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, has been publishing the mugshots of the people who've been arrested for demonstrating in Minneapolis and pairing them with images of Department of Homeland Security officers with their backs turned to the camera, right? It's a violation of the Department of Justice policy to show the face of someone who is accused but not yet convicted of a crime, right? It's a form of public humiliation and intimidation. You have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. The Attorney General is flouting the policy of the Department of Justice, says a little bit about what the Department of Justice is becoming. But please note, right, in a sense, the study in courage, right, that there you have the people who are demonstrating to save our democracy being displayed facing the camera, and the people who are attacking them, and by extension, attacking our democracy, unwilling to show their faces, right? So I do think these images distribute respect and sympathy in a way that is highly injurious to this administration and highly beneficial to democracy. We've seen this come to its fruition, its culmination this week. The other item from the news that I want to emphasize from this week is the fact that the Environmental and Protection Agency has withdrawn or reversed, overridden the so-called endangerment finding around greenhouse gases. And I'll give just a little bit of background on this, right? The Environmental Protection Agency was established in the early 1970s with enabling legislation, the Clean Air and Water Acts, that empowered it and required it to determine which pollutants, which chemicals, which particulate matters in our air and water endanger human health in the United States, and then to promulgate effective regulations to mitigate or remove the endangerment, right? And in the 2010s, the Environmental Protection Agency found that greenhouse gases are a danger to human life in the United States, and so that the EPA can regulate them. And the basis of that finding, I want to be as clear as possible, it's different from, and let me just speak for a second, to one of the landmark EPA decisions around endangerment, which concerned lead in the gasoline, right? And I just hope this is clear. Because the EPA found that lead in the gasoline endangers human health, we now have unleaded or de-leaded gasoline, right? Lead is an additive. They just stopped adding it to the gasoline. And the result is that IQ, right, intelligence for children has gone up about 10 points since the lead has been removed from the gasoline across the country on average, right? And so there was so much lead in our air, in our water, in our environment, on the trees the kids were climbing, that it was actually causing developmental damage to their brains. We remove the lead. Children are developing greater intelligence as a result, right? We are suffering less cancer as a society. We are living longer, right? This is the kind of thing the EPA is supposed to do. And then coming back to the endangerment finding around greenhouse gases, right? The finding was a little bit different, right? I think that you can say that hundreds of thousands of people who would have died because of lead are not dying, right? The cancers are not developing. In the case of climate change, in 2024, the most recent year for which I think we have complete data, it's fewer than 1,000 Americans who died from events directly traceable to climate change, from floods and fires and that kind of thing, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. But if we look at what the EPA did in its original finding, it wasn't just measuring who's killed by, right, the fire. It was measuring in a way that's similar with lead. How many years of life will be lost in aggregate to the people of the United States due to the increased stress on their bodies caused by increased temperatures? And the figure was hundreds of thousands of years of life lost. And so that is a danger, right? And the science on this is very clear. It's being studied throughout the world, and throughout the world, similar findings are being reached. And, right, the way in which the EPA actually does its work, right? How does it find what endangers us? It assembles panels of scientists and experts to study these issues. And so one of the first thing that the Trump administration did when it took power was to fire all of the scientists on the advisory panels to the EPA and to replace them with people much more friendly to the fossil fuel industry. And right, just to be clear, right, the holy grail for the fossil fuel industry was removing the endangerment finding, because it now means, right, that they can continue to explore, continue to drill, baby, drill, continue to burn, baby, burn as much fossil fuel as they want to in the United States. And by the way, the people who really pay the price will not be us in this room, but, right, our grandchildren. And let me just now give the silver lining in all of this. I think it's an abysmal development. It speaks to the degree to which the Trump administration is corrupting all of the major agencies of the federal government. And when I say corrupting, I mean not allowing them to operate according to the law, according to the purposes, the values, the norms for which they were established, not allowing them to do, in other words, the people's business, but instead, right, this is a sell off to the highest bidder. The fossil fuel industry gave $500 million to the Trump campaign to help him get elected. The transactional president is paying them back, even though the right consequence of removing these restrictions is that his grandchildren, our grandchildren, will suffer. I'm sure he thinks his won't, because they'll have enough money to, right, exempt themselves from the worst of the consequences of, right, this catastrophe that is looming. And I think, there's some plausibility to that. If Mar-a-Lago is not underwater, they can be in the nice air conditioned, right, environments of the Trump resort. But let me now give the silver lining. Sorry. The silver lining is, frankly, the United States may not matter that much in all of this. Presumably, eventually, the EPA will be allowed again to do its work, and we'll go back to being sane. But in the meantime, China is galloping ahead with the development of sustainable or alternative green energy technology. And by the way, India is transitioning very quickly to green technology in its energy system, and Africa may be, obviously, you got to disaggregate it, but taking the continent as a whole, um, transitioning even more rapidly. And so if we look at this in terms of, right, 500 years ago, every place on Earth had essentially a sustainable energy system. We used the energy of our bodies, of animal bodies, occasionally cutting down trees to get some energy from them. And in so doing, right, we were just using what the sun gave us on an annual basis. Around 200 years ago, we discovered sunshine underground. We discovered, right, all of the stored solar energy in fossil fuels, and we started burning them. And in the United States, we moved to an almost exclusively fossil fuel dependent energy system. The same is true for Europe. But in China, they didn't move exclusively to a fossil fuel based energy system because they started to develop sustainable technology. They moved maybe 75, 80% of the way the United States and Europe moved, but then back up to a sustainable energy system. By the way, Europe is moving in that direction too. India went less far, right? Maybe 70% of the way to an entirely fossil fuel based energy system, but then started to move to a sustainable energy system. In other words, the later the country is in the developmental process, the less likely they are to use exclusively fossil fuels to drive their energy transition. And fortunately, the United States, though it has the largest economy in the world, does not have anything like the majority of the world's population. The majority of the world's population lives in places in Asia and Africa that are not following our suit. Our policy is retrograde. It's moving backwards. It's a hindrance to what the world needs to do. The only good news in all of this is, first of all, we're a tiny fraction of the world's population. And second of all, frankly, market forces are going to continue to drive our economy in the direction of sustainable energy, even when the president is trying to drive it in the opposite direction. All right, I'm sorry, I went on for longer than I intended to. Let me just ask any questions about either of those issues, comments, thoughts about other things in the news you want to discuss, or can I get on with abundance, affordability, and well being? Going, going, not seeing any hands, not seeing anybody unmuting themselves. I'm going to go right into the subject matter for today. Um, so, as you will remember, right, the reason I'm talking about this topic with you is because I think there's no doubt the United States has an affordability crisis, and the Democrats seem to be strongly focused on this issue in 2025, 2026, the build up to 2028, and they seem to be embracing a policy agenda that was really put on their map by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. This is an abundance agenda. And the simple way to think about this is that the Democrats have tried for maybe the last 25 years to solve the affordability crisis by giving people more resources to afford what's too expensive, right? So the Affordable Care Act, I think, would be a critical example of this. Subsidize people who can't afford health care in their capacity to buy health care. And the issue is not only that the Trump administration removed those subsidies, and so people who had taken them for granted no longer have them. It is even when those subsidies were in place, healthcare was still really expensive for those who qualified for them. And so the new program here, the new idea is let us return to trying to influence the supply of essential goods and services that are currently too expensive, right? That's what abundance means. Increase the supply of healthcare, increase the supply of pharmaceuticals, increase the supply of housing, increase the supply of public transportation, of healthy food. And so I could keep going, childcare, education, etc. But bring prices down on the supply side, not subsidize, right, the capacity of people to purchase them on the demand side. And this would, on this account, begin to solve the affordability crisis. It gives the Democrats a fresh play, right? We've tried these other policies, they're discredited. Now Trump's tried his policies, they're not working, they're discredited. Which party is going to come up with a new agenda to actually address the affordability crisis? If the Democrats can get out of the gates first with a credible agenda, it will be to their advantage. And by the way, we need the Democrats to win, not just because we favor their policies, but because, frankly, they're the only party right now standing up for the institutions of constitutional democracy on which the justice, the fairness, the accountability of our government rests. And so that's the argument, right, in news for the abundance and affordability agenda. My question, the reason I bring the third term in, well-being, is the root of much of the discontent with the way in which government and society are working in the United States today, affordability? Or is it broader than affordability? Is it more encompassing, more existential, if you will, right? Is it the case that many people feel that the organization of our society no longer works to promote our well-being? And if that's the case, right, and if the discontent is driving the turn away from democracy and toward strongman leadership and autocracy in the United States and elsewhere in the democratic world in the 21st century, then, right, we need to figure out what the root cause is. If we want to get the medicine right, we got to get the diagnosis right. And so my question is, right, are there sources beyond affordability that are driving satisfaction with the kind of life that we have in the United States and driving a substantial portion of the American population against the democratic system, right? And so that's the issue that we've been talking about together. I'm continuing to do research and thinking on this topic. I came across newly published data from Gallup, right? And Gallup has been doing this for quite a while, asking people, right, how they evaluate their current life and what they expect from the future. And please note, right, that if you get a score below 70%, and last year, 2025, the score was 62%, right? That is indicative of dissatisfaction or malaise. That's where we are. But then there's a second thing to notice, which is much of the time, right? Especially when the economy is doing reasonably well, and in many respects, the economy is doing reasonably well right now. We're not in a recession, right? We have relatively low unemployment, relatively low inflation. People expect the future will be better than the present. But in the United States, for the last couple of years, people actually expect that the future is going to be worse, not better, right? And by growing margins, right? And so again, just a new sign that something is amiss. This is looking at the data in a slightly different way on life evaluation. Are you or are you not thriving, right? And the thriving rate is below 50%, right? For the first time since 2020 in the United States, in right the middle of 2025. And of course, 2020 is the COVID, right, epidemic. And so pandemic. And so the idea that, right, that we're not in a pandemic, we're not in a recession, we don't have a major crisis in our society other than the manufactured emergencies of our federal government. Something else seems to be dragging us down. And by the way, there are big partisan disparities in this, and Democrats are in 2025 much less optimistic about the future of America than Republicans are. But Republicans are less optimistic than they have been in the past when Republican presidents have been in the White House or the Republican Party has been in control of the federal government. So Trump is not uplifting even Republican prospects. I've spoken with you about this repeatedly. I'm not going to belabor it, but right, we have become a much more unequal society. We've also seen a right sustained increase in the price of goods. I don't think that's intrinsically unhealthy, but when wages are stagnant and prices are increasing, the bottom 20%, the bottom 40%, maybe the bottom 60% has a hard time keeping up with those prices. And this is reflected then in the kind of consumer economy we've become, in which the bottom group of society is spending proportionately less, and the top 10% is accounting for nearly 50% of the consumption in our economy. This is almost the definition of an up or out economy, in which you move up to the top or you're left out of wealth, income, and consumption. Luxury consumption is dominating our economy and coinciding with widespread precariousness at the bottom and insecurity and envy in the middle. This is the economics of an unhappy society. I do think this helps to account for some of what I'm about to point to. I'm sorry, my slides advanced. And this is right. that we have a rush, a race, tremendous velocity in the autocratic takeover being right executed by the Trump administration. Um, and please note, right, I've noted Trump's approval is way down, but he still has the support of roughly 40% of Americans, the strong support of 26% of Americans, right? And so it appears that maybe 1 in 4 Americans support an autocratic transformation of the executive, a weakening of checks and balances and the rule of law. And then I'll just point out when we look at the shift in support from Trump, I'm sorry, from Obama to Trump, right? We're going back now, right? So of the 24 counties that switched from blue in 2012, right, voting for Obama, to red in 2016, voting for Trump, only 4 had thriving rates exceeding 53% in the preceding year. And so, right, 80% of the movement at the county level in the direction for Trump was in counties with low rates of thriving. And so the idea that people who say this system doesn't work for people like me anymore, right? We do not have confidence in our future. We are not happy in the present. And so we need someone to come in and fix the system. And by the way, the Democrats, they're too nice. They're too mealy-mouthed. They're too willing to abide by procedures and the niceties of legality and constitutionalism, checks and balances, deliberation to get done what needs to be done. We need radical change. We need somebody to grab the system by the collar and shake it. And that is someone who doesn't respect procedural constraints. That's why we're voting for Donald Trump. I'm right interpreting this data for you. I do want to note, right, that this is not the only thing happening in the United States. The fact that the support for autocracy is going up is driving many other people to double down in their support for democracy. We're less complacent about our ability to continue our experiment in democracy, ironically, as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, of our coming into being as an experiment in democracy. We also perceive that this experiment is in danger. And many of us, like the brave people of Minneapolis, are rallying to its defense. And so we have what I've called, right, regime polarization, and that partisan polarization and regime polarization are overlapping. That the Democratic Party is becoming a small d Democratic Party, standing up for the institutions of democracy. That the Republican Party, its name notwithstanding, is becoming increasingly the party that supports strongman leadership, autocracy, competitive authoritarianism, as it's sometimes called, right? And that's a really dangerous place for our country to be in. It's dangerous because essentially the Democrats have to win at least some power in every election to prevent the march of autocracy from continuing to complete its transformation of our government. I've shared with you my fear, which is that this agenda will keep radicalizing, that Donald Trump is not an aberration, that he's brought about the transformation of his party, and that the people who are vying to succeed Donald Trump are doing so in part by vying to be more radically strongman, autocratic, authoritarian, anti-immigrant, anti-liberal, anti-globalization, anti-right. I could keep going, elite, but anti-civil rights, anti-education, and that the consequence of right this contest is that democracy is going to be on its back foot, that constitutionalism is going to be under siege, that the norms and laws that sustain it will be gradually chipped away, and frankly, that the reform that we desperately require to make these institutions work better for us will not be possible because it's very hard to bring about, right, meaningful reform when you're defending what you already have. So, with that diagnosis, I conclude by noting, and this is right the diagram from Yasha Monk's The People versus Democracy. I've modified it slightly to number the boxes to indicate a kind of sequence of change that I think Munk is describing, and the idea, right, that whereas in the right second half of the 20th century in the United States, we could take for granted that we had liberal democracy and that everyone supported it, right? If you go back to the previous diagram, the level of support for democracy in the United States is very high. The level of support for, and let me modify this, liberal democracy, constitutional democracy. I prefer democracy in which the majority gets the control over the key institutions of the federal government, but does not get to run roughshod over the rights of minorities and individuals. Those are maintained and constrain what the majority can do. In an autocracy or competitive authoritarianism, no such constraints. We're seeing support for that form of government rise, and Munk suggests that this is happening throughout the democratic world, and that in the 21st century, right, we are going to see the perpetual threat that illiberal democracy unconstrained by a constitution or the rule of law, is going to be a perpetual possibility. Depends on the outcome of the most recent election, whether it is in power and chipping away at liberal democracy, or out of power and merely waiting for the next election cycle to perhaps regain control. Right. So with that background, I return to the affordability crisis in particular and suggest again, just to reprise what we've looked at, that at least in the big picture, it doesn't appear that what is ailing America can be exclusively understood in terms of affordability. That affordability is, right, complex. It includes a whole bundle of goods. And if we look at that whole bundle of goods relative to wages, it's not exceeding the increase in wages for most of the last decade. Quite to the contrary, wages are actually going up more than prices. Now, I'm going to make this more complicated in a second, but part of what this kind of data doesn't take into account is what it's like to be at the bottom 20%. It's average data, or what it's like to try to be making ends meet if you're newly starting a job in a family in San Francisco or New York, and the most expensive places where the opportunities for employment are perhaps the best, but the cost of living is the highest, right? And so some of what we would need to do to figure out how much we have an affordability crisis is really to drill down, get out of the macro data and look at this population group by population group, income group by income group, geographic area by geographic area. But as opposed to doing that, I want to do something else. And this, again, is just review, look at the affordability of housing in the United States. And again, this is geographically specific, but it also, at this point, generalizes for the country as a whole. And note that 1950s, 60s, 70s, the ratio of a cost of a starter home to annual income was about 2.5 to 1, and that in more recent decades it's up to 7 to 1. And the result is, right, that if you look at the value in the change of a cost of a home versus the income change, right? The incomes have not kept up with the cost of housing. What this means is, especially in big urban areas, more and more people are renting, and the people who are renting are seeing their cost of living increase more than the rest of us, right? And of course, we know if we get a 30-year fixed mortgage, right? We pay the same amount on day one as we pay in the last payment on that mortgage per month, right? And the result is that our cost of living associated with housing is fixed for presumably the majority of the rest of our lives. That is a huge benefit economically. But I also want to notice that owning a home is a symbolically freighted commodity in our economy, right? It means I've made it. I've reached the middle class. I've obtained the status of being a respectable member of my society and community. My interests are going to be taken more seriously by my local government. And the books I have on the board, The Ideology of Home Ownership by Richard Ronald, Race for Profit by Keeanga Tamata Taylor, which looks at the racially specific dimension of this, right? We associate home ownership with actual economic security and social standing for good reasons. But when more and more people are excluded from home ownership, they don't just feel more economically insecure, they also feel more socially marginal, like the social contract no longer includes them. And so that would be one place where I would say the affordability diagnosis seems right. But having said that, right, I think that the well-being crisis cannot be reduced to the affordability crisis. One way to see this, and I think this is very important research done by the Core Score group, and it doesn't just do it for the United States, it does it globally, so that we know that our well-being score is very low down relative to comparable nations, right? And when I say comparable, well-developed countries with constitutional democracy, despite the fact that we're among the wealthiest of those countries with the longest standing democracy, we're close to the bottom of the group in terms of well-being. We can break it down a little bit as we have done, and we can note that in particular, political voice, economic security, and economic opportunity are all dragging down the idea of well-being. This can't be reduced to purely economic factors if political voice and health are in the mix. One last way to look at this, and I'll again just quick review, but I think this diagram is really clear, right? In many respects, the American economy has outperformed almost all of its peer economy, the rest of the well-developed economies of the world, over the last decade or 20 years. If you look at GDP per capita, right, that's a pretty good metric of how our economy is doing overall. It continues to go up and up and up. And yet, if you look at another way of measuring well-being, a social progress index, right, and this is collected by the group Social Progress Imperative, right, our social progress has completely come uncoupled from economic growth and in fact is slumping while the economy is steaming ahead, right? And so again, I just want to be careful here, right? Economic growth does not equal affordability. They're different issues. But this seems to be an indication that increases in economic well-being are not driving increases in overall well-being, or at least that we should suspect that the two are not the same. And securing affordability by securing a greater supply of essential goods like housing will be important. Will be important in relieving stress and making a pathway to economic security viable and available to more Americans, but that it probably won't be the be all, the end all of well being. And if that's part of what's driving the turn against democracy, it behooves us to get clear about what else we can be doing to address the well being problem. So, I've reviewed with you. I won't go further into Klein and Thompson's basic framework, right? The idea that we used to have an abundant supply of goods thanks to New Deal and post-New Deal policies, creating much more housing, much more education, much more affordable transportation in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. As we transitioned away from that and into, on the one hand, environmental liberalism, and on the other hand, neoliberal conservatism in the United States, we've ended up with a less abundant supply, more hoarding of resources and opportunities, and that we need to return to an abundance agenda to restore faith in the American experiment, in the prospect for a better future, as the subtitle of their book reveals, right? I want to start today the conversation about what other aspects we should be looking at beyond the supply of housing, healthcare, childcare, education, and transportation, etc. Let me start by the idea that there are other economic goods that are not well captured in terms of our capacity to consume essential goods and services. And I'm going to tick these off, and then I'm going to start going into more detail. The first one I'm going to call a just or free division of labor. And this goes back to Emil Durkheim, who broke into the attention of almost all intellectuals in Europe at the end of the 19th century by publishing a book called The Division of Labor in Society, in which he suggested the division of labor is not merely an economic, but much more a social institution, and that the division of labor helps us to feel a kind of solidarity with each other to the degree that all of us are doing things that assist everyone in flourishing. I'm reading some material by Elizabeth Anderson right now. I'll get into that in a moment, where she refers to the economy as a system of joint production. And she points out that, for instance, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, pick your billionaire, would not eat, would not have their basic services if it were not for thousands or tens of thousands of other people doing much less well. And the result is, right, that we should regard all of us as dependent on each other and dependent on a system of cooperation that benefits everyone. And that the division of labor, when it functions that way, makes us all feel like we are contributing, benefiting, and that we have a certain dependency on each other that gives us a commonality or solidarity with each other. But for that to be the case, jobs have to fit people's capacities and vice versa. We have to have a fair opportunity to develop our skills and talents, and the job market has to award positions to people on the basis of their qualifications. This is what Durkheim calls a free, a just, or an unforced division of labor. And so, as you can see, I'm going to go into a variety of other economic factors that I think have to do with more than consumption, right? Can I get the kind of job that I think I deserve, right? Is my society fairly distributing jobs to people in a way that allows them to flourish in the workplace? That's not going to be addressed by abundance, right? That's a deeper question about the economy. Similarly, are the inequalities of income and wealth sufficient to justify or incentivize socially valuable labor being done, but not so large to lead to lead to the kinds of inequality that are democratically or psychologically, I'm sorry, I wrote constructive. Obviously, it should be destructive. The idea being here, right? If we let Elon Musk, right, who apparently posted a racist tweet on the social media platform he now owns almost every day in January, right? And when I say racist, white supremacist, right? Arguing that white people are being discriminated against and that white people are superior and that the future of humanity and civilization requires protecting and empowering white people, right? I'm sorry, but the idea that the richest man in the world is so rich that he can take over one of our most important media systems and engineer it to promote his views, that is too much inequality. But in addition to that, in ways we've talked about, if our society becomes too unequal, we all become prone to social evaluative threat, to constantly looking up and down and comparing ourselves with others. And remember, right, comparison is the thief of joy, right? We might be pretty well satisfied with what we have until we look across the street and see that the Joneses have twice as much. And then it leads us to question, do I really have what I want? Good or decent jobs so that no one is degraded, subordinated, or abused as a condition of having work-life balance, right? Work leaving sufficient time for other valued pursuits, sufficient compensation and benefits to meet both material and social needs. And I'll get into this. I think those two are distinct, right? It's one thing to have enough to eat. It's another thing to have enough to turn out in public and feel like you belong. And both of those things I think should be regarded as needs in an affluent economy, and our compensation should meet both of those needs. Opportunity for agency, efficacy, and satisfaction at work. And so those are the kinds of things I want us to pay attention to economically, not just the supply of abundant goods. Let me start the conversation by looking at the person who, right, really framed these issues, Emile Durkheim, right, a French Jewish sociologist from the late 19th and early 20th century, one of the two founders of modern sociology, along with Max Weber. And I also have on the board a wonderful contemporary scholar. Now that I'm looking at the picture, I didn't get the best picture of him, Fred Neuhauser, who was until very recently a professor of philosophy at Barnard and Columbia, recently retired. I think that has something to do with the way in which Columbia caved to the Trump administration and disciplined its students. He also has a position in Germany, which he continued with. And the idea, going back to Durkheim, that Neuhauser has really focused our attention on recently, that we can have integrative or we can have pathological divisions of labor in our society. One that integrates us, that makes us all feel that we are part of a shared enterprise and valued within that enterprise, is a free and fair division of labor, right? Each of us can compete for the opportunity to develop our skills and talents and then get the jobs that reward how well we've cultivated our capacities. That's a fair, open, free, integrative division of labor. And as opposed to that, a division of labor that basically only allocates prized economic goods, including careers and jobs, to those who are already privileged or high status or in possession of familial resources, that's going to generate ultimately a pathological division of labor, an unfair, unfree, forced division of labor, in which I say the reason I have the job I have is not because it's well suited to my skills, but because of who my parents were, or where I live, or what race or gender I've been assigned. And that does not allow me to view my work as rewarding, as fair, myself as contributing to a fair system of social cooperation. And so the idea, right, that we have an extensive division of labor brought about by a labor market in a well-functioning modern economy and society, that this is essential to allocate potential workers to roles efficiently, right? Do we need more doctors? Do we need doctors who are willing to sacrifice, right, substantial portions of their youth to acquiring the skills we want from doctors? Well, then we better pay them more, right? And so this gets to the idea that the incentives that the market gives to people to do the work that we value them doing are primarily in terms of higher wages, better benefits, but also more rewarding work. And so there's a reason to have an economy that just doesn't let anyone be a doctor, right? Irrespective of skill or qualification, that would not be a good economy. If we want people to be doctors, we got to pay them more. That sounds right. But if anybody who has the potential, has the capacities, has the skill, and does the work to develop those capacities can be a doctor, then maybe none of us should resent the fact, yeah, they get more pay, they have more education. And by the way, we all benefit from their having this more interesting, more rewarding work because we all want good doctors, right? But the idea that if that's going to be the case, it has to be the case that all workers have equal access to work that allows them to develop their capacity for economic contribution. And when this principle is violated and we end up with a forced and unfree division of labor, many people resent the work they have to do to make ends meet. I know I'm out of time. I'm just going to share with you for a moment where I want to go with this. And I want to share with you two ideas, right? The first is that we have kind of a continuum of types of division of labor, where there are forms of the division of labor that are open and free, and hence compatible with all of us thinking of ourselves as each other's equals in a democratic society. Um, and on the other hand, forms of the division of labor where, because of our inherited or caste or racial or status position, we are only able to do this kind of work, right? Or because our parents have wealth and therefore we can get into the right schools and acquire the right skills, right? We have opportunities that other people don't have, and people resent. They're angry and aggrieved over the unfair distribution of opportunity because what it means is that across their entire lives, they're not able to access the kind of work they think they should. And then I would suggest that this, right, is compounded by um, another variable. And here, by the way, I do have Elizabeth Anderson's influential work on what she calls private government, the government of the workplace, and then a more recent volume, Working as Equals. If we have degrading work, if we have stultifying work, we may come to view the kind of work that we have as incompatible with our standing as democratic equals. Whereas if we have minimally engaging work or even better, good jobs, or some of us at least great jobs, this may be compatible with democratic equality. And in a society in which, right, large portions of the population have stultifying jobs, some people have degrading jobs, And the reason that you feel you're stuck in a stultifying or degrading job is not because it's the only kind of work you can do, but because your parents didn't have enough money or because of where you live, right? Then many people are going to be angry, are going to feel that this is an unfair economy and that it's failed to distribute fairly one of the essential goods of life: meaningful, decent work that allows you to stand in your society as an equal and to experience your work on a daily basis as rewarding and affirming. If we're not fairly distributing that, the fact that many more people can buy houses, I conjecture, is not going to be sufficient. And so let me conclude today by asking, and it's an open question, were we doing better in the middle of the 20th century at having a fairer or freer division of labor, at providing more people with at least minimally decent or good jobs? And if we were, and if we've moved in the opposite direction in the last 30 odd years, does that help to account for some of the decline in well being in our country in ways that won't be solved just by making even essential goods and services more affordable? Do we have a deeper problem that is going to require other instruments to solve? That's the big question. That's where we're going. Hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's a break from all things Trump all the time, and also helps us to understand maybe why we have Trump and what we need to do if we're going to escape with our democracy intact from the difficult circumstances we're in right now. Flossie, please do unmute yourself, and I'm eager to hear what you want to say. I'm guessing it's not another Valentine's Day poem. Go ahead. You got to hold your space bar down, please, or else hit that microphone icon.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Two things. One of my former students is a reporter, and I mean a good reporter, and she went to Minneapolis to report for the publication she works for. What she reported was that when the arrests occurred, um, when the protests occurred, and the John Donnery came out and started bullying people, was the protests were so genuine and so against the people who were trying to, well, the people who were arresting others or keeping the protesters from speaking too much, that in Minneapolis, people were on the side of those who were being persecuted and those who were fighting for justice. She also got herself close to the Mexican border, where she saw some really ugly, ugly things done to families who were being broken up. Part of their kids going to Mexico, they had been born in the U.S., and they were taking a chance to go back to Mexico. And things again were so ugly that what is happening, except for those who were turning to somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene for help, is that the public is beginning to feel some kind of anger against Trump and the people who represent him because they seem to have no other choice. So I'm beginning to hear that there's a real kind of anger at being American and being pushed around. I take that as a good sign. And we're having reporters who are keeping their profiles low. They're just reporting what they see, and what they see is ugly enough to make the people who read papers and publications angry too, and who take a vow that they're not going to be pushed around. I don't know if that's hopeful, but I'm glad we have some young people who know how to report and keep things as clean and as careful as they can, knowing how the result will be, that it will be against tyranny and, shall I say, and for freedom. I hope that's so.
And thank you for that, Flossie. And I think that's exactly right. And so one of the things I'll say, right, about the reports coming out of Minneapolis is I don't think it's probably possible to capture how thoroughgoing the occupation and siege of Minneapolis is in its disruption of everyday life in the city, right? The city is absolutely saturated and overwhelmed with federal law enforcement. It's unpredictable where they're going to be. And when they arrive, it's anarchy. The city, the neighborhood, the block grinds to a halt. It's very often flooded with men with weapons that look like they're in a combat zone, with tear gas and flash grenades, etc., and that the people who are trying to observe, and please note, right? I mean, I think this is extremely important. When you have a lawless paramilitary force sent by your government into your neighborhood, and when the leaders of that occupying paramilitary force lie routinely and without restraint, how are you going to establish any kind of accountability for the crime, for the violence, for the brutality that they rain down on the people you live with? You have to get out there and document it, right? And so I kind of jokingly last week referred, I think it was last week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, to the right to bear phones, right? But I really do think that this is important. The right to witness, the right to establish the factual record when your government is lying to you is what, among other things, the people of Minneapolis are standing up for. And yes, I completely agree with you, Flossie. I do think that we have a natural disposition to feel sympathy for people who are suffering from injustice, oppression, cruelty. And what is emerging, thanks to the journalists, but also thanks to the ordinary citizens of Minneapolis, is a record that helps us to see this is not, right, a orderly, legal law enforcement operation. This is a tyrannical effort to coerce a city into submission. And in saying that, right, again, I'll notice that both Kristi Noem and Pam Bondi have put into writing, right? This is part of the lawsuit that Minnesota ultimately lost, trying to force the federal government to withdraw its surge. They put into writing, well, if Minneapolis and Minnesota will change their policies, if they will stop being sanctuary cities, if they'll do what we want them to do, if they'll hand over their voting records and their Medicare and Medicaid records, then we'll stop, right? And please note, right, that makes it crystal clear. This is an effort to punish a blue city for its policies and for, right, standing up for the law and its rights. It does not have to turn these records over to the federal government. And the idea, right, that they put it in writing speaks of the impunity with which they believe they can use violence to cow, right, their political enemies, not the other party, not their fellow citizens, but the people who they view at this point as not deserving, right, treatment that accords with the rule of laws or the Constitution and the rights it protects. So, yes, we need the people of Minneapolis to document this. We need the good reporters who are working there to continue to report on this. And yet, I think at the same time, we cannot possibly understand what it's like to be there because I think it's just, impossible to convey what it's like to be tear gassed every other day, right? Unless you've had that experience. All right. Thank you, Flossie. Really good report. I appreciate it. Anybody else with a thought or a comment for today? Yeah, Sandy, go ahead.
I really appreciate your discussion of well-being and meaningful work. I think that's really so very important, and I'm really glad we're focusing on that. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Sandy. And I'm obviously not done. It's where I'm going. And I think one of the questions is if we had more meaningful work in the middle of the 20th century than we do today, what's driving that? And here I would say, right, well, unions might be one of the big factors, right? When unions can stand up for workers, workers can actually generate the force to remove some of the degrading aspects of their work. And then also technology, right? And the idea that so much work in the 21st century is essentially makes workers appendages to their right phones or computers, that it's cognitively de-skilling their work, making it such that they don't have to use their brains, right? They're just robotic laborers. Yeah, there's more to be done. And then you add to that, by the way, it looks like the top 20% are hoarding all the opportunities to get what's left of good work, and everybody else is left, right, with sorry bullshit jobs. That this is a unfair structuring of opportunity to what is too few good jobs, leaving too many people to do degrading, demeaning, indecent work. Yeah, I do think that that's part of where I really want to shine the light in terms of the economic sources of lack of satisfaction or well-being in the 21st century. And then we got to start talking about some non-economic factors as well. Barbara, go
I
ahead. Oh, yeah. Sandy, you want to follow up?
wanted to say Trump capped the amount of money you can borrow for medical school and law school. A person couldn't possibly go through all of medical school and law school with the amount of money that he's allowing them to borrow. So
Sandy, my
that
son is applying to law school right now, and it's one of the things we're thinking about because what it means is you can't get federally guaranteed or subsidized loans anymore for the full cost. So you have to use private loans, which are not fixed interest loans. And so, in essence, you don't know what the total amount you're going to be paying for your education is. Yes, among the many things, right, where we could bring Trump into the conversation. Barbara, go ahead.
One of the things that puzzles me or has puzzled me or has bothered me over the last 30 years is the drifting. I mean, as the middle class shrinks, I think back on what middle class jobs were and what the relationship with the workplace was. Growing up in the 50s and early 60s, almost everybody I knew, regardless of what their parents did, doctors, lawyers, kids had jobs in high school. The low-level jobs, maybe not meaningful, but they were expected to earn at least part of their spending money. And during college, whether your parents were full board paying or you were on full scholarship, you had work requirements. It wove in with your studies. But those jobs taught you something because you were working with the people that were 20 years older than you, doing those shit jobs, perhaps. You became friends of a sort, and you were able, as you worked, through high school, through college, maybe through graduate school, maybe at an Ivy League school, maybe at the junior college and that path, but you were working some, not all the time, but some jobs in the summer paid. Jobs in the summer now don't pay.
Yeah.
And I think people of our generation maybe had a better appreciation for what those shit jobs actually were and appreciated the people that did them. I mean, now, as people who perhaps benefited from that, the parents of people my children's age, no, the other way around, the parents who are the friends of my children's age now say, my son's job in high school is to get really good grades and get into the best college possible. No, I have to drive him everywhere. I this, I that, and that silver spoon that you may not have been born with is shoved into your mouth, and it's not silver. But if you do, what I'm seeing is if you get into those highly sought colleges, whether it's, UC's and Stanford and the Ivy League and the seven, whatever they used to be, the seven brother-in-laws, whatever, they come out and they do get jobs through their parents, which did happen in the past, but they have no empathy, no sympathy, and they believe that they deserve it.
Yeah.
And when you believe that you deserve it, you have very little tolerance for the people that didn't work as hard as you did in third year trigonometry. Well, we don't teach trigonometry anyway.
So I got the point, Barbara, and I'm going to comment really quickly. I completely agree, and it's a big can of worms. But as a former stock boy, bag boy, butcher's apprentice, and then mechanics assistants, right? That those were the jobs I did when I was in high school. I obviously didn't go on to become a butcher or a mechanic, but it humanizes those kinds of work for you. It lets you see, even if you're not doing them, that it's real people who are doing them, and that the value that comes from doing them is genuine value for all of us. But then I'm going to add very quickly that we live in an era of what's called concerted cultivation of children, right? And then there's a whole big literature on this, but the idea that if your child's going to get into college, right, they don't just have to get good grades, they have to be a star of the soccer team and the first chair in the violin in the orchestra, and even better, also, the president of the chess team or the debate club, and that it's real, right? That because we have fewer opportunities for good work, the competition to get them, and then the competition to get the kind of education that enables to get them is growing more and more intense, right? And I think I've talked with you about this before, right? But that scarcity produces competition, and that competition tends to amplify scarcity. We are stuck in that downward spiral right now. And by the way, in addition to depriving the children of the experiences that generate some empathy, some compassion, some solidarity with the people who do the shit jobs, right? It also deprives them of happy childhoods, right? I think we should feel a certain amount of empathy for them, which may make them less compassionate for another reason, right? And so, yes, this economy is in many ways structured in ways that are, right, not just bad for the people at the bottom, maybe bad for all of us and pulling us apart. I think that's a good note, a sad, dour note, but a good note on which to leave off for today. Good to be with all of you guys as always. Looking forward to continuing next week. Be well. Happy Valentine's Day. See everybody in a week. Thank you guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Barbara.
you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.